The bustling airport terminal pulsed with a steady hum as travelers zigzagged between rows of crowded seats, luggage in tow and eyes glued to their boarding passes. Among the sea of hurried strangers, Jordan Cole stood out, a tall, composed man in his early 40s with skin the color of rich mahogany and eyes that held a quiet confidence. His tailored suit and leather carry-on hinted at success, but the slight tension in his jaw suggested someone who had learned to expect, rather than assume, respect. Today, though, was supposed to be different. It was a rare chance for Jordan to relax, to leave the high-stakes world of piloting behind for a few hours and settle into the passenger seat instead. With his pilot's license tucked away in his bag, he looked forward to enjoying this flight as a passenger, a brief reprieve from his demanding schedule. As he approached the line for first-class boarding, Jordan adjusted the grip on his bag, savoring the familiar scent of jet fuel and coffee that filled the air. But his moment of calm shattered the instant he caught sight of her. Emily Reese, a flight attendant with impeccably styled blonde hair and a uniform that seemed pressed to perfection, stood at the front of the line. As her gaze locked onto Jordan, her blue eyes narrowed, a faint sneer twisting the corners of her mouth. She seemed to scrutinize him, her gaze sweeping over his expensive watch and tailored suit as though they were counterfeit. Jordan felt the disdain in her stare, but he kept his expression neutral. This wasn't the first time he'd encountered judgment from strangers, and he doubted it would be the last. Still, he hadn't expected it to come from someone whose job was to welcome him aboard. "Excuse me, sir," Emily said, her voice laced with a thin veneer of politeness, but with the slightest edge that couldn't be missed. "Are you sure you're in the right line? Economy boarding is over there." She gestured vaguely toward the far end of the terminal, a smug smile curving on her lips. Jordan held her gaze, unflinching, and slowly extended his boarding pass. He said nothing, his expression calm, refusing to let her words unsettle him. Emily's face tightened as she glanced at his first-class ticket. For a brief moment, her eyes widened in surprise before narrowing again, a faint flush coloring her cheeks. She scanned his pass, her manicured fingers clicking against the paper as though she could somehow force it to change. "I see," she muttered, thrusting the pass back at him with a forced smile. "Enjoy your flight, Mr. Cole." She punctuated her words with a hint of sarcasm, as though the very idea of his presence in first class was an affront. Jordan took the ticket back, inclining his head slightly. As he walked past her toward the jet bridge, he heard her mutter under her breath, "I guess they're letting anyone fly first class these days." He paused mid-step, his shoulders tensing. The words hung in the air, sharp and biting, but he forced himself to ignore them. He wouldn't give her the satisfaction of seeing him react. With a calm that masked the simmering frustration beneath, he continued down the bridge, his back straight, his stride unbroken. Behind him, he could feel the stares of the other flight attendants who had been watching the interaction. Among them, he noticed a young man with kind eyes, who frowned, his gaze lingering on Emily. He leaned toward the woman beside him, whispering, "Did you see that? Emily's way out of line." The woman shrugged, casting a nervous glance at Emily before lowering her voice. "It's not our place to say anything," she whispered back, her eyes darting away. "You know how she can be." Jordan took his seat in first class, stowing his bag in the overhead compartment and sinking into the plush leather. He let out a slow breath, willing his pulse to slow. He was here to enjoy his flight, not to get tangled up in someone else's prejudice. But the tension lingered, a reminder of the unspoken barrier he knew too well, the kind that could turn a simple flight into a battleground for dignity and respect. As he settled in, he closed his eyes, letting the low hum of the engines ground him, the sound an old and familiar comfort. He reminded himself that he was more than the judgments of others, more than the narrowed eyes or whispered assumptions. He was here for himself, to relax, to rest. But as the plane prepared for takeoff, Jordan couldn't shake the feeling that this flight was destined to be anything but ordinary. The cabin filled with the soft, welcoming glow of overhead lights as the plane leveled off. beginning its journey to a city where no one knew Jordan Cole's name or story. Leaning back in his seat, he took a steadying breath, trying to brush off the earlier tension. Yet, he could still feel the weight of the stairs, the echoes of Emily's sneer lingering in the air around him. His instincts told him this wasn't the last he'd see of her tonight. It didn't take long for his intuition to be proven right. As the seatbelt sign dinged off, Emily emerged from the galley, pushing a beverage cart laden with neatly arranged drinks. Her entire demeanor had transformed, now radiating warmth and charm as she served the passengers in the front rows. She leaned in close to an elderly couple across the aisle, her voice lilting with a sweetness that bordered on syrupy. They exchanged pleasantries, the woman laughing softly as Emily poured their drinks with practiced care. Jordan watched the interaction out of the corner of his eye, the contrast in her behavior impossible to ignore. Every smile, every kind word, seemed to sharpen the memory of the disdain she'd shown him at the gate. Then, she reached his row. The brightness in her expression faded in an instant, replaced by a cold, impersonal stare. She set a napkin on his tray table, followed by a plastic cup of water. The movement so abrupt that some of the water splashed over the rim, leaving droplets on the tray. "Thank you," Jordan said, keeping his voice level. She didn't respond. Instead, she turned sharply on her heel and moved on to the next passenger, her back rigid. For a brief moment, Jordan felt the urge to call her out, to ask if there was a reason she'd gone out of her way to treat him differently. But he held back, deciding that any reaction would only feed her animosity. Further down the aisle, he caught sight of Daniel, the younger flight attendant with kind eyes he'd noticed earlier. Daniel was watching the interaction closely, his brow furrowed. He looked as though he wanted to intervene, to say something, but hesitated, his gaze flicking nervously between Jordan and Emily. When their eyes met, Daniel offered Jordan an apologetic smile, a silent acknowledgement of the treatment Jordan was enduring. Jordan returned the smile with a small nod, appreciating the gesture, though Daniel's sympathy couldn't erase the sting of Emily's attitude. It was a reminder that not everyone aboard shared her prejudice. The tension in first class grew thicker as the service continued. Emily's voice carried through the cabin as she chatted with other passengers, her tone light and engaging, filled with warmth for everyone except Jordan. The elderly couple behind him leaned toward each other, whispering, "Did you see the way she treated that gentleman?" The woman murmured, her voice tinged with disapproval. "It's disgraceful." Her husband nodded, his brows furrowing. Someone should say something. Jordan heard them, but he didn't turn around. He knew from experience that such moments rarely turned into action. People noticed. Sometimes they whispered, but they rarely intervened. That was the unspoken rule. Observe, disapprove quietly, and move on. At the front of the cabin, Daniel seemed increasingly uneasy, shooting glances in Jordan's direction between assisting other passengers. Finally, as he walked past Jordan's seat, he paused, leaning in slightly. "I'm so sorry about that, sir," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "If there's anything you need, please don't hesitate to ask." Jordan appreciated the young man's kindness, a refreshing change from the blatant disrespect he'd faced. He gave Daniel a reassuring nod. "Thank you, Daniel. I'm fine." Daniel's face softened with relief, though his gaze held a trace of regret as he continued down the aisle. The contrast between Daniel and Emily was striking, and Jordan wondered how much of Daniel's silence was out of fear of speaking up. Moments later, a familiar voice broke through the cabin as the co-pilot emerged from the cockpit. Likely headed for a quick break, he scanned the cabin, his eyes briefly settling on Emily, who straightened under his gaze. For a split second, Jordan thought he saw something like disapproval flicker across the co-pilot's face, though he said nothing as he continued down the aisle. With a sigh, Jordan returned his focus to the book he'd brought, attempting to block out the low buzz of murmurs and sidelong glances. But the tension lingered, a reminder of the invisible line that Emily had drawn the moment he'd stepped onto the plane. Yet Jordan's thoughts drifted to something else as well. A quiet, unwavering resolve that had carried him through moments like this before. He had faced obstacles throughout his life, challenges that had only strengthened his character, making him the man he was today. Emily's behavior was a reminder that while progress had been made, the battle against prejudice was far from over. He took a sip of his water, his hand steady as he placed the cup back on the tray. He could feel the weight of the cabin around him, the whispers, the sideways glances. But he met it all with a silent fortitude. Whatever Emily's intentions were, she would not define him. And while he had come here simply as a passenger, he could sense that this journey was far from ordinary, destined to test not only his patience but his resolve in ways he hadn't anticipated. The flight had settled into a steady rhythm, with the low hum of the engines filling the cabin as passengers settled in for the journey ahead. Jordan leaned back, allowing himself to close his eyes and focus on the familiar, comforting sounds of flight. But just as he felt himself begin to relax, a sudden lurch snapped him upright. The plane dipped abruptly, shuddering as it hit a rough patch of turbulence. The jolt sent a ripple of gasps through the cabin, and Jordan instinctively tightened his seatbelt, his pilot's instincts kicking in as he assessed the situation. Something about the turbulence felt off, too sudden, too jarring. A few rows back, an elderly woman clutched her husband's arm, her face pale as the plane shuddered again. Jordan glanced toward the galley where Emily was bracing herself against the wall, her expression a mix of irritation and fear. But it was Daniel, the young flight attendant with the kind eyes, who seemed the most shaken, his face drained of color as he gripped the overhead compartment for support. Then came the announcement. The familiar crackle of the intercom echoed through the cabin, but the co-pilot's voice was strained, thick with tension. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your co-pilot speaking. We're experiencing a minor issue in the cockpit. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. We appreciate your cooperation." The words were calm, professional, but Jordan heard the strain behind them, the unmistakable edge of urgency that even the most seasoned pilot would struggle to mask. He had been in enough emergencies to know that this wasn't just ordinary turbulence. Something was seriously wrong. As if to confirm his fears, a flight attendant rushed from the front of the plane, her face pale as she pulled Emily and Daniel aside near the galley. Jordan watched as she leaned in close, her words muffled but laced with panic. Yet in the tense quiet of the cabin, her whispers carried. "The pilot, he collapsed," she hissed, her voice trembling. "He's unresponsive. The co-pilot is trying to manage. But he's alone up there. We need to land." But with this turbulence, Emily's eyes widened, a flicker of shock breaking through her composed facade. Daniel, on the other hand, looked completely stunned, his gaze flicking toward the cockpit door as he processed the gravity of the situation. Jordan felt his heart rate quicken, not from fear, but from the surge of adrenaline. He knew exactly what this meant. The plane was in danger, and he was one of the few people on board who could help. Without hesitation, Jordan unbuckled his seatbelt and stood up, moving with purpose toward the huddled flight attendants. He cleared his throat, drawing their attention, and spoke with the calm, steady authority of a man who knew exactly what he was doing. "Excuse me," he said, his voice low but firm. "I couldn't help overhearing. I'm a pilot. I have experience with situations like this. Let me help." The attendants turned to him, their expressions a mix of surprise and skepticism. Emily, true to form, was the first to respond, her face twisting in disbelief. "You," she scoffed, her earlier disdain bubbling to the surface despite the crisis. "You're a pilot? We're not taking any chances with amateurs. This is a real emergency." Jordan met her gaze without flinching, his expression steady. "I assure you, I'm no amateur. I've been flying commercial aircraft for over a decade. Every moment we waste here puts everyone on this plane at greater risk." His words seemed to cut through the tension, their urgency forcing Emily to reconsider. Around them, passengers who had overheard the exchange were beginning to murmur, some calling out in support of Jordan. "Let him help," an older man said, his voice rising above the others. "If he's a pilot, what are we waiting for?" Daniel glanced from Emily to Jordan, his face tight with worry but his eyes filled with determination. Without waiting for Emily's approval, he moved to the intercom, his hands shaking as he pressed the button. Co-pilot. This is Daniel from the cabin crew. We have a passenger who says he's an experienced pilot. Should we send him up? There was a tense pause, every second stretching like an eternity, before the co-pilot's voice crackled through, thick with relief and desperation. If anyone on board has flight experience, we could really use the assistance. Send him up immediately. Daniel exhaled sharply, turning to Jordan with a look of gratitude and hope. Sir, please, follow me. As Daniel led him toward the cockpit, Jordan felt the weight of the passengers' stares, their silent prayers riding on his shoulders. Some offered quiet words of encouragement as he passed, and he nodded in acknowledgement, his mind already racing through possible scenarios and solutions. They reached the cockpit door, and Daniel punched in the security code with trembling fingers. The door swung open, revealing a scene of barely controlled chaos. The captain was slumped in his seat, his face pale and his eyes closed, while the co-pilot frantically managed the controls. His face streaked with sweat as he fought to keep the plane steady. Thank God, the co-pilot breathed, his shoulders sagging with relief as Jordan stepped inside. Are you the pilot? Jordan nodded, already moving toward the empty seat. Jordan Cole, commercial pilot with over 12 years of experience. What's our situation? The co-pilot launched into a quick briefing, explaining the turbulence and the sudden incapacitation of the captain. Jordan listened intently, his hands moving to the controls with the practiced ease of a seasoned professional. First things first, he said, his voice calm and steady. Let's get us out of this turbulence and stabilize the flight path. Then we'll coordinate with air traffic control for an emergency landing. The co-pilot nodded gratefully, visibly relaxing as Jordan took charge. Together, they worked in seamless coordination, each movement precise and controlled. Jordan's hands flew across the controls, making minute adjustments to their altitude and heading, his eyes darting between the displays as he processed the situation with lightning speed. This is Flight 237 declaring an emergency, Jordan announced over the radio, his voice clear and commanding. We have an incapacitated pilot and are requesting immediate clearance for an emergency landing. Current position is, as he relayed their coordinates and situation to air traffic control. The co-pilot watched in awe, his earlier panic replaced by a newfound confidence. The man who had been dismissed and disrespected in the cabin was now their best hope for survival. Back in the cabin, word of Jordan's actions spread quickly. Passengers fell silent, eyes fixed on the cockpit door as they clutched their armrests. Some whispered prayers, others exchanged hopeful glances. For many, Jordan's calm under pressure ignited a spark of reassurance, a glimmer of hope amid the fear. Meanwhile, Daniel and Emily were stationed near the galley, watching Jordan's calm efficiency with a mixture of shock and awe. Emily's earlier skepticism had faded, replaced by a stunned silence. For the first time, she seemed to grasp the weight of her assumptions, her expression shifting from disbelief to something closer to shame. As the plane steadied, the turbulence subsided, and a collective sigh of relief rippled through the cabin. In the cockpit, Jordan and the co-pilot worked in perfect sync, navigating the plane toward the nearest airport for an emergency landing. With each adjustment, each steady command, Jordan reminded everyone aboard, not through words, but through action, of the strength of character, skill, and composure that transcends prejudice. At that moment, he was not only a pilot, but a testament to resilience and grace under pressure. And as the runway lights finally appeared in the distance, illuminating the path to safety, Jordan knew this was more than just a flight. This was a journey that would leave an indelible mark on everyone aboard, a moment that would be remembered long after the wheels touched the ground. The runway lights glimmered far in the distance, a beacon of safety through the darkened sky. Jordan Cole's focus was unbreakable as he guided the plane with a steady hand, each movement precise and confident. In the cockpit, the atmosphere had transformed from chaos to calm. a quiet determination uniting Jordan and the co-pilot as they worked in seamless tandem to bring the plane down safely. Gear down, Jordan instructed, his voice calm and authoritative. The co-pilot immediately complied, the whirring of hydraulics filling the cabin as the landing gear lowered. Every instinct, every ounce of experience Jordan had gained over his 12-year career sharpened his focus. This was more than a flight. It was a mission, a chance to bring everyone home safe. In the cabin, the passengers held their breath. Tension etched on their faces. Whispers passed through the rows like a ripple, recounting how the man who had been dismissed earlier was now their only hope. The fear that had gripped the cabin was slowly giving way to something else, a glimmer of trust, of admiration. Word of Jordan's background spread quietly, and passengers exchanged looks of awe and relief. Daniel, the young flight attendant, moved briskly through the cabin, instructing passengers on the brace position with a calm professionalism that belied the tremor in his hands. He paused at one row, leaning down to reassure an elderly couple who looked particularly shaken. "Is he really a pilot?" the elderly woman asked, her voice trembling. Daniel nodded, his expression softening. "Yes, ma'am, and not just any pilot, one of the best. We're in good hands." At the front of the cabin, Emily hovered near the galley, her once confident demeanor replaced by a pale, shaken expression. She watched Jordan through the open cockpit door, every precise command and assured movement challenging the assumptions she had made earlier. Shame prickled under her skin, tightening her throat as she remembered the way she had dismissed him, the way she'd let her prejudices blind her to the reality before her. As Jordan expertly guided the plane through its descent, he glanced at the co-pilot, who was visibly relieved, his tense posture softening. Jordan's calm had infected him, the younger man's hands no longer shaking as he focused on assisting Jordan's commands. "Air traffic control has cleared us for an emergency landing," the co-pilot announced, his voice steadier than before. "We're set to touch down at Newark Liberty International in about 5 minutes." Jordan gave a brief nod, his gaze never leaving the runway that loomed closer with each second. "Let's make it a smooth one. Passengers have had enough of a scare tonight." He turned to the intercom, his voice calm and reassuring as he spoke to the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Jordan Cole. We'll be making an emergency landing shortly. The situation is under control, and I want to thank you for your cooperation and patience. Please follow the instructions of the cabin crew and prepare for landing." The passengers exchanged glances, some nodding, others visibly comforted by the calm in Jordan's voice. Even those who had been too consumed by their own fear to notice the earlier drama now felt the reassurance in his words. Jordan wasn't just flying the plane, he was guiding them to safety, a quiet strength radiating from him like a protective shield. As the plane descended, Emily, still stationed near the galley, caught Daniel's eye, a flash of regret darkening her features. She opened her mouth to speak, but words failed her. For once, she had no rehearsed response, no shield of arrogance to hide behind. All she had was the stark, uncomfortable truth. When the wheels finally touched down, a collective sigh of relief washed through the cabin, mingling with the sound of cheers and applause. The plane slowed, the roar of the engine subsiding as they taxied toward the gate. Jordan felt a wave of satisfaction, tempered with exhaustion, settle over him. He had done it against prejudice, under pressure. He had done what he had trained his whole life to do. Once the plane came to a stop, the cockpit door opened, and Jordan rose from his seat, stretching his stiff muscles. The co-pilot looked at him with awe, his voice thick with gratitude. "Thank you, Captain Cole. I can't believe what you did. You saved us." Jordan gave him a nod, a modest smile touching his lips. "It was a team effort. You did well under pressure." As he stepped into the aisle, he was met with a wave of grateful faces. Passengers reached out, some shaking his hand, others offering words of thanks. An elderly man with tears in his eyes gripped Jordan's hand tightly. "Thank you, son. My granddaughter's waiting for me. You've given me the chance to see her again." A young mother held her child close, nodding at Jordan with a smile filled with admiration. "You're a hero. You saved us all." Jordan nodded to each person, his heart swelling with a quiet pride. But as he continued down the aisle, his gaze settled on Emily, standing near the exit, her face pale and her eyes wide with remorse. She took a step toward him, wringing her hands, her voice barely above a whisper. "Captain Cole, I don't know how to," she trailed off, her voice cracking as she searched for the words. "I'm sorry. The way I treated you, it was wrong. I misjudged you. And I was so wrong." Jordan held her gaze, his expression unreadable for a moment. He saw the shame in her eyes, the painful recognition of her own prejudice laid bare. He nodded slowly, his voice steady and measured. "Thank you, Emily. I accept your apology. But remember, this isn't just about me. The way you treated me reflects something larger. We need to judge people by their actions, not their appearances." Emily's eyes filled with tears, and she nodded, visibly shaken. His words seemed to linger with her, a quiet but powerful rebuke, one she couldn't easily dismiss. As Jordan exited the plane, he was met by a team of airline officials, led by a senior manager who reached out to shake his hand, his voice filled with respect. "Captain Cole, I'm David Martinez, Senior Operations Manager. I don't have words to thank you for what you did today. You not only saved lives, you protected our airline from what could have been a terrible tragedy." Jordan shook his hand firmly, his tone humble. "I'm just glad I could help." Passengers continued to express their gratitude as they filed off the plane, many recounting his courage and skill to anyone who would listen. But it was Emily's face, etched with guilt, that lingered in his mind as he left the terminal. Jordan knew this flight would stay with everyone who had witnessed it, including Emily. And as he looked out at the city lights glowing in the distance, he hoped that she, like the others, would take away a lesson far more important than just a safe landing. This journey was not only about surviving the crisis, it was about challenging assumptions, breaking down the walls of prejudice, and choosing to rise above. As he walked out into the night, his pilot's license secure in his pocket, Jordan felt a renewed sense of purpose. He had spent years perfecting his skill, honing his instincts, but tonight had proven something deeper. That character was just as vital as skill. And sometimes, it was in the darkest moments that true character shone the brightest. The crisp night air brushed against Jordan Cole's face as he stepped onto the jet bridge, his mind still reeling from the adrenaline that had carried him through the emergency. Around him, passengers flooded off the plane, murmuring their awe, relief, and lingering shock. Some exchanged looks of disbelief, while others stole glances at Jordan, their eyes filled with gratitude and admiration. What had started as an ordinary flight had transformed into a journey none of them would ever forget. In the midst of the crowd, Emily, the flight attendant whose scornful looks had shadowed him from the beginning, stood to the side, her face pale and her shoulders slumped. She watched as Jordan shook hands with passengers, her expression a mixture of regret and shame. Every handshake, every heartfelt thank you, seemed to chip away at her, as though each reminder of Jordan's heroism underscored her own misguided judgment. Gathering her courage, she stepped forward, her hands fidgeting, voice shaky. "Captain Cole, Jordan," she hesitated, struggling to find the right words. What I did, the way I treated you, it was unforgivable. I made assumptions, and I was wrong. So wrong." Jordan looked at her, his gaze steady but softened by a trace of understanding. He could see the turmoil in her eyes, the weight of her realization pressing down on her. Her apology wasn't just a formality. It was the result of a painful reckoning. "Thank you, Emily," he replied, his voice calm but firm. "I accept your apology. But remember, this isn't just about me. The assumptions you made, they're a reflection of something bigger. People deserve to be seen for who they are, not judged by appearances or biases." Emily's face flushed, her eyes brimming with unshed tears as she nodded. His words carried a weight she knew she'd carry long after they parted. a lesson etched deeply into her mind. As Jordan walked into the bustling terminal, he was met by David Martinez, a senior manager for the airline. Dressed in a tailored suit, Martinez extended his hand, his expression a mix of awe and gratitude. "Captain Cole, I don't think we can ever thank you enough," Martinez began, shaking his hand warmly. "Your actions today saved lives and averted a potential tragedy for our airline." "I'm speechless." Jordan gave a modest nod, humility tempering his expression. "I'm just glad I could help," he said simply. Passengers continued to stream past, some lingering just long enough to thank him one last time. Among them was a young woman clutching her phone tightly. She approached Martinez, her face tense with resolve as she held her phone out to him. "Sir, I think you need to see this," she said, her tone urgent. A video played on the screen, a recording of Emily's dismissive treatment of Jordan before the flight. Martinez's face darkened as he watched, the light in his eyes hardening into something closer to anger. Behind him, an elderly couple who had noticed Emily's behavior chimed in. "The way that flight attendant treated Captain Cole was disgraceful," the woman said, her voice trembling with emotion. "If it hadn't been for him, I don't even want to imagine." Martinez took a deep breath, glancing at Emily, who stood a short distance away, her face ashen. "Thank you for bringing this to my attention," he said gravely, then gestured for Emily to follow him aside. "Emily, I need a word with you immediately." Jordan watched as Martinez led her away, their conversation unfolding quietly but with unmistakable intensity. Emily's shoulders slumped, her face etched with remorse and fear. Moments later, Martinez called over another airline employee, instructing them to escort Emily to the office for immediate termination procedures. In the background, Jordan could hear passengers discussing the incident, their voices a mix of indignation and relief. For many, it was a stark reminder of how assumptions and prejudices could shape an experience, this time with near-disastrous consequences. Daniel, the young flight attendant who had treated Jordan with kindness throughout the ordeal, approached him, looking slightly nervous. "Captain Cole, I just wanted to say, I'm sorry I didn't speak up sooner. I saw what was happening, but I was afraid to challenge her." Jordan placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "The important thing is that you did the right thing when it mattered. Daniel, sometimes speaking up takes courage. Learn from this. And next time, don't be afraid to stand up for what's right." Daniel nodded, relief and gratitude flickering across his face. "Thank you, Captain Cole. I'll remember that." As the terminal began to quiet, Jordan found himself surrounded by a small group of passengers, each eager to express their appreciation. An elderly man reached out to shake his hand, his grip surprisingly firm despite the tears in his eyes. "My granddaughter's waiting for me back home," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Thanks to you, I'll get to see her again." A young mother stepped forward, her son peeking out from behind her, wide-eyed with admiration. "You're a real-life hero," she said warmly. "My son here hasn't stopped talking about how you saved us all." Jordan knelt down to the boy's level, offering a gentle smile. "You know," he said, "you can be anything you want to be. Just remember, it's not about what you look like or where you come from. It's about doing your best and treating others with kindness." The boy nodded, eyes shining with awe. "When I grow up, I want to be just like you," he whispered, a shy grin breaking across his face. As Jordan stood up, a deep sense of fulfillment washed over him, the gratitude in the faces around him, the lives he had helped to save. These were moments no title, no career accolade could ever capture. He had stood firm in the face of prejudice, rising above it to prove that integrity, courage, and character were what truly defined a person. His thoughts were interrupted by a tap on his shoulder. David Martinez had returned, his expression somber yet determined. "Captain Cole, I want to thank you again on behalf of the airline," Martinez began, his voice laced with sincerity. "We owe you a debt of gratitude. If there's anything we can do, an upgrade for your next flight, a meeting with our CEO, please. Just say the word." Jordan shook his head, a modest smile touching his lips. "Thank you, But that's not necessary. If you really want to make things right, consider using this incident to spark change within your organization. Implement stronger diversity and inclusion training. Make it clear that discrimination has no place here. Martinez nodded, a look of resolve hardening in his eyes. You have my word, Captain Cole. We'll make this a priority. What happened today won't be ignored. With a final handshake, Jordan turned to leave, his pilot's license secure in his pocket. The terminal was still buzzing with activity, but something had shifted. He could see people talking, recounting the events of the flight, their eyes reflecting a newfound awareness. And as he walked away, he knew this journey wasn't just about a safe landing. It was about confronting the biases that lurked beneath the surface and showing the world the strength of character that transcends assumptions. As he stepped outside into the cool night air, he took a deep breath, savoring the quiet. The ordeal had left him exhausted, but the sense of purpose thrumming through him was stronger than ever. He thought of Emily, her humbled expression, and hoped that this experience would lead her toward growth and understanding. He thought of Daniel, and the courage he had shown despite his hesitation. Most of all, he thought of the passengers, strangers whose lives had become intertwined with his in the most unexpected way. Jordan hailed a taxi, sliding into the back seat. As the driver pulled away, he gazed out the window, watching the city lights blur into streaks of gold against the dark sky. Today had tested him, challenged him in ways he hadn't anticipated. But as he looked forward, he felt a renewed sense of resolve. This was more than just a flight. It was a catalyst for change, a reminder that every act of resilience and compassion had the power to chip away at prejudice. And as he headed toward the future, Jordan knew he was ready for whatever lay ahead. This was only the beginning of a much greater journey. The next morning, Jordan awoke to his phone buzzing with messages. As he scrolled through the notifications, he realized the story had gone viral. Clips of his calm announcements from the cockpit, passengers' tearful expressions of gratitude, and even Emily's initial disrespect toward him were spreading online. Headlines declared, "Hero pilot saves passengers from mid-flight crisis," exposing hidden bias along the way. Social media was filled with praise, but also with a collective outrage that the very person who had saved the day had faced such blatant discrimination beforehand. Sitting on the edge of his hotel bed, Jordan scrolled through messages from family, friends, and strangers alike. People from all over the world were reaching out, sharing how his story had resonated with them, how it highlighted an all-too-common reality faced by people of color. Some shared their own experiences of prejudice. Others expressed support and admiration for his resilience and courage. Then, a particular message caught his eye. It was from David Martinez, the senior operations manager for the airline. His email was formal, but layered with an unmistakable tone of urgency and sincerity. Dear Captain Cole, after yesterday's extraordinary events, we would like to meet with you at our headquarters this morning. The CEO herself would like to discuss the incident and explore how we can ensure something like this never happens again. Your bravery has brought not only admiration, but also an opportunity for important reflection within our organization. We look forward to seeing you at 10 a.m. Sincerely, David Martinez, Senior Operations Manager. The weight of the email settled over Jordan. He had never sought attention, and he certainly hadn't asked for this level of public scrutiny. But he also knew this was more than a chance to receive accolades. It was an opportunity to spark real, systemic change. Later that morning, Jordan arrived at the airline's headquarters, a sleek skyscraper towering over the city. He was greeted by a young intern who led him through a series of glass-walled corridors, where employees turned to watch him pass, their expressions a mix of respect and curiosity. Word of his actions had clearly reached every corner of the company. They reached a boardroom on the top floor, overlooking the city skyline. Inside, a group of executives awaited him, including Amelia Reeves, the airline CEO. She was a tall, poised woman in her mid-50s, with a sharp gaze that conveyed both authority and warmth. As Jordan entered, she stood, extending her hand with a smile. "Captain Cole, thank you so much for coming," she said, her voice filled with genuine gratitude. What you did yesterday was nothing short of extraordinary. Thank you, Ms. Reeves, Jordan replied, shaking her hand. I'm just glad I could help. They took their seats, and for a moment, there was a heavy silence as the executives exchanged glances. Finally, Amelia cleared her throat, looking directly at Jordan. Captain Cole, I want to start by apologizing, she began, her tone sincere. The way you were treated by our employee was unacceptable. This is not the culture we strive to uphold, and I can assure you that steps are already being taken to address it. Jordan nodded, his expression calm but focused. I appreciate that, Ms. Reeves, but this is bigger than just one person's behavior. It's about the culture that allowed it to happen. People like Emily hold certain biases because they feel they're allowed to. There's no accountability. It's not just about a single incident. It's about how we train, support, and hold our employees to higher standards. Amelia listened intently, nodding thoughtfully. You're absolutely right, Captain Cole. This is an opportunity for us to reflect and, more importantly, to act. We're already developing a mandatory diversity and inclusion training program, and we plan to implement it company-wide. But we don't want this to be a superficial fix. We want to do it right. She paused, glancing at her colleagues before continuing. We'd like to offer you a role as our Chief Diversity and Inclusion Officer. Your experience, your insights, and your strength could help guide us toward meaningful change. We would be honored to have you lead this effort. Jordan blinked, momentarily stunned. The offer was prestigious, a powerful role that would allow him to directly impact the company's culture. But he also knew the cost. It would mean stepping away from the cockpit, from the life he loved. Ms. Reeves, he said, choosing his words carefully. I'm honored by the offer, but my heart isn't flying. I became a pilot because I love it. That's where I belong. Amelia nodded, her expression understanding but resolute. I get it, Captain Cole, but perhaps we could find a middle ground. What if you stayed on as a senior pilot and took on an additional role as a diversity consultant? You'd still be flying, but you'd also help us build an inclusive culture. You'd mentor young pilots, especially those from underrepresented backgrounds, and advise us on creating lasting change. Jordan considered her words, a spark of hope flickering in his chest. It was the best of both worlds, a chance to keep flying while also championing a cause he believed in. He looked around the room, taking in the faces of the executives who watched him with expectation. I'd be willing to take on that role, he said finally, his voice firm, but only if this commitment to change is real. It can't just be training sessions. It has to be structural, a shift in the way we think and operate. Amelia's face softened into a smile. Agreed. Captain Cole, let's work together to make this a turning point for the airline. They spent the next hour discussing plans, Jordan sharing insights from his own experiences and pushing the executives to think beyond checklists and training modules. He challenged them to address bias in hiring, promotion, and daily interactions. His vision was clear: create a workplace where respect, equality, and inclusivity were more than just words on a mission statement. When the meeting concluded, Amelia stood and shook his hand again. Thank you, Captain Cole. I believe this is the beginning of something transformative. As Jordan left the building, he was met by a small group of reporters who had caught wind of the meeting. They called out questions, their eyes alight with curiosity. Phones raised to capture his response. Jordan hesitated, realizing that his words here would shape the public's perception of the airline's response. He took a deep breath and stepped forward. The airline has acknowledged what happened and has committed to change, he began, his voice calm but powerful. While the actions of one person were wrong, this is an opportunity for all of us to confront our biases. My hope is that this isn't just a reaction, but the start of a shift in the way we treat one another. One reporter leaned forward, her pen poised. How do you feel about the flight attendant's termination? Jordan looked thoughtful for a moment, then answered, while her actions were unacceptable, I hope this experience leads to growth, not just for her, but for all of us. Discrimination, however subtle or overt, has no place in our society, and I believe we all have a responsibility to look at ourselves and work to be better. The crowd murmured with approval, a few onlookers clapping quietly. Jordan gave a small nod of appreciation before turning to leave, his steps purposeful as he made his way through the crowd. As he stepped into the cool air outside, his phone buzzed with a text from Leah, his wife. She'd watched the press conference live and sent him a simple message: "Proud of you. Always." Jordan smiled, feeling the weight of the day lift slightly. He knew the road ahead would be filled with challenges. That real change was slow and often met with resistance. But for the first time, he felt a profound sense of purpose. This journey had started with a single act of courage, but it was far from over. As he hailed a taxi, he thought of the passengers, of Daniel, and even of Emily, and of all the people who would be impacted by this change. It was a reminder that every journey, no matter how unexpected, had the power to change lives. And as he rode back to his hotel, watching the city blur past, Jordan knew he was ready to be a part of that change. This wasn't just about him. It was about making sure that the next time someone stepped onto a plane, they'd be seen for who they truly were, not for the prejudices others held. The taxi rolled to a stop, and Jordan stepped out, feeling a quiet strength settle within him. Today had shown him the power of integrity, resilience, and the courage to demand better. And as he walked toward the lobby, he felt ready to take on whatever came next, knowing he was helping to chart a new course, not just for himself, but for everyone who would follow. The world had changed for Jordan Cole overnight. What began as a private act of courage on a mid-flight emergency had catapulted him into the public eye, drawing attention he had never sought and scrutiny he hadn't prepared for. But as he sat in his hotel room, scrolling through the thousands of messages pouring in, Jordan knew this was more than just a fleeting moment of fame. His story had struck a chord. The video footage, initially posted by a young woman on the flight, had quickly gone viral. It captured Emily's disdainful treatment, the tense atmosphere in the cabin, and finally, Jordan's calm, assured voice as he took control in the cockpit. Clips of him exiting the plane to applause, his brief statements to reporters, and the dignified way he had handled the ordeal spread across social media like wildfire. Headlines around the world proclaimed him a hero, not just for his actions in the cockpit, but for his calm, graceful response to discrimination. The comments that accompanied these videos ranged from admiration to outrage. From personal stories of resilience to calls for justice, people shared their own experiences of facing prejudice, of enduring silent indignities, and expressed how seeing Jordan stand tall had inspired them. They praised his strength, his composure, his dignity. Then, amid the outpouring of support, Jordan noticed an unexpected message from a prominent civil rights activist, one he had long admired. Her words struck him deeply. Captain Cole's story is a reminder of the strength and resilience required to face prejudice every day. His courage and professionalism show us that true strength is about integrity, not just when people are watching, but when it matters most. Hashtag fly without bias. Jordan let out a breath, realizing just how far-reaching the impact of his actions had been. This wasn't just about a single flight. It was about confronting a deep-seated prejudice that many people endured silently. His story had turned into a beacon for others, a call to examine their own biases and strive toward empathy. His phone buzzed, jolting him from his thoughts. The caller ID showed Leah. He picked up, and her familiar, warm voice filled the line. "Jordan, are you okay? I just saw the news," Leah said, her voice tinged with both pride and worry. "Why didn't you call me?" Jordan let out a soft chuckle, feeling a pang of guilt. "I'm sorry, Leah. Things moved so fast. I didn't even have time to process it all myself. I'm okay. I promise." A pause, and then Leah's voice softened. "You know, the kid saw you on the news this morning. Maya couldn't stop talking about it. She kept telling her friends, 'That's my dad. She's so proud of you.'" "Jordan, we all are." Jordan's throat tightened at the mention of their 10-year-old daughter. Maya had recently experienced racial bullying at school, a painful experience that had left her confused and hurt. He and Leah had done their best to guide her, to help her understand that prejudice said more about the person showing it than the person receiving it. And now, to know that she saw him as an example of resilience, it meant everything. "Tell Maya I love her," Jordan said, his voice thick with emotion. "And thank you, Leah, for always believing in me." After ending the call, Jordan leaned back in his chair, staring out at the cityscape, feeling both the weight of responsibility and the support of those he loved. He knew he would need every ounce of that strength in the days ahead. The following morning, Jordan made his way to the airline's corporate headquarters, where the executive team was waiting to discuss the future of his new role as a diversity consultant and senior pilot. As he entered the lobby, employees turned to watch him, their expressions reflecting a mix of admiration and respect. It was as if his story had become part of the fabric of the company overnight. An intern greeted him and led him to the executive floor, where he met with Amelia Reeves, the airline CEO, along with a team of high-ranking officials. They welcomed him warmly, and Amelia wasted no time diving into the plans she had in mind. "Captain Cole," she began, "we're honored to have you on board with us in this new role. Your story has touched people across the country and around the world. You've given us not just an opportunity, but a mandate to set an example for the industry." Jordan nodded, his expression serious. "Thank you, Ms. Reeves, but I want to make sure this is more than just a response to a viral moment. Real change doesn't happen because of one incident. It happens when we examine our systems and hold ourselves accountable to a higher standard." Amelia exchanged a look with her team, a small smile of respect on her face. "Agreed, Captain Cole. Our first step is rolling out the diversity and inclusion training we discussed. But beyond that, we'd like you to work closely with us to create an environment where everyone, passengers and employees alike, feels valued and respected. We're considering mentorship programs, scholarship funds, and new policies to support our diverse staff." As she spoke, Jordan felt a sense of purpose settling over him. This was more than just an assignment. It was a chance to make a lasting impact. The role wasn't about being a symbol or a figurehead. It was about fostering real, meaningful change. The meeting continued with detailed plans, timelines, and goals, each initiative designed to dismantle the invisible barriers that had persisted for too long. By the time they wrapped up, Jordan felt a renewed sense of optimism. The airline's commitment seemed genuine, and he was ready to hold them to it. When he stepped out of the boardroom, he was surprised to find a small crowd of reporters waiting outside the building. Somehow, word had leaked about his new role, and they were eager for his thoughts. Jordan took a moment to gather himself, then stepped forward, his face calm but resolute. "Captain Cole, can you tell us about the changes the airline plans to make?" one reporter asked, her microphone thrust toward him. Jordan held her gaze, his voice steady. "The airline has committed to creating a more inclusive environment for everyone. We're implementing diversity and inclusion training, mentorship programs, and a broader cultural shift to address and dismantle prejudice." A second reporter raised his hand. "And what about the flight attendant involved? How do you feel about her termination?" Jordan paused, choosing his words carefully. "Her actions were unacceptable, and accountability is necessary. But my hope is that this isn't just about punishing one person. This is an opportunity for everyone to reflect on their biases, to challenge their assumptions, and to work toward empathy and respect. Change doesn't happen in a vacuum. It's something we all have a part in." As he finished speaking, a ripple of applause spread through the crowd. He gave a grateful nod, then stepped back, politely declining further questions as he made his way through the throng of reporters. Later that evening, Jordan returned to his hotel room, exhaustion finally catching up to him. He dropped onto the bed, letting out a long breath as he stared at the ceiling. The last few days had been a whirlwind of emotions, a mix of pride and responsibility that weighed heavily on him. His phone buzzed, and he glanced at the screen to see a text from Leah. "Saw the interview. You were incredible. Jordan, the kids are so proud of you. And so am I. I'll love you." Jordan smiled, a warmth spreading through his chest. He thought about Maya, how she might one day face the same struggles he had, and how he hoped his actions would make her path just a little easier. As he closed his eyes, Jordan thought of all the people who had reached out, the strangers who had found strength in his story. He thought of the airline staff, now facing a new chapter, and the passengers who had shared that fateful flight. But most of all, he thought of the future, a future where stories like his would become the rare exception rather than the painful norm. This journey had begun with a single act of courage in the face of prejudice, but now it was evolving into something greater, a ripple effect that, he hoped, would inspire others to rise above, to demand better, and to create a world where everyone was seen for who they truly were. As sleep finally claimed him, Jordan Cole drifted off with a sense of peace, knowing that the road ahead was one he was ready to walk. This wasn't just the end of a flight, it was the beginning of a movement. And for the first time, he felt truly free. The following weeks passed in a blur of meetings, press appearances, and endless strategy sessions. Jordan had accepted the airline's offer to be a senior pilot and diversity consultant, splitting his time between flying and implementing new initiatives. It was a balance he hadn't anticipated, yet one that felt right. He was still in the sky, doing what he loved, but now he was also working to ensure a lasting legacy within the company. The airline was moving swiftly to put its promises into action. The first wave of diversity and inclusion training had rolled out across the organization, and plans for mentorship programs and scholarship funds for underrepresented groups were well underway. The company seemed genuinely invested in turning the turbulence of that fateful flight into meaningful, lasting change. Then one day, during a break between flights, Jordan received a message that stopped him cold. It was from Emily. "Captain Cole, I don't know if you'll even read this, but I wanted to reach out. I've been doing a lot of reflecting since that day. Losing my job was a wake-up call, and I understand now how deeply ingrained my own biases were. I'm attending diversity training courses, and I've even taken a job as a customer service representative. I know it's a step down, but it's given me a fresh perspective on the value of empathy. I just wanted to say that your words stayed with me. They pushed me to change." Jordan sat with the message for a long moment, feeling a mix of emotions: surprise, relief, and, finally, something that felt like closure. He had seen a spark of remorse in her eyes that day in the terminal. But this was something else. Emily had taken accountability, had chosen to confront her own prejudices and actively work to change. He typed a response, each word carefully chosen. "Emily, thank you for reaching out. Change is never easy, and it takes courage to confront biases within ourselves. I'm glad you're taking this journey. Remember, progress is a daily choice. Wishing you all the best in your journey forward." After sending the message, Jordan felt a quiet peace settle over him. Forgiveness, he realized, wasn't about erasing the past, but allowing people the space to grow from it. He hadn't expected Emily to reach out, but her decision to own her mistakes reminded him that even the hardest hearts could soften with time and effort. A few weeks later, Jordan found himself back at the airline's headquarters for the launch of a new initiative. The airline had decided to establish a scholarship fund for aspiring pilots from underrepresented backgrounds. The program was close to Jordan's heart, a tangible way to open doors for young people who might have been overlooked or discouraged from pursuing aviation. As he stood at the podium, looking out at the crowd of employees, executives, and invited guests, he felt a powerful sense of purpose. He spoke about the importance of representation, of creating a world where everyone had a fair chance to soar, regardless of their background or the color of their skin. "Today," he said, his voice steady, "we're not just launching a scholarship. We're making a statement that talent, determination, and character will always take precedence over assumptions and prejudice. My hope is that these young aviators will go on to inspire others, and that the journey we began that day in the sky will continue in ways we can't yet imagine." As the event concluded, Jordan found himself surrounded by young, aspiring pilots who had come to witness the launch. Many of them looked at him with admiration and respect, and he felt a deep sense of responsibility. He spoke to each one, sharing advice, listening to their stories, and encouraging them to pursue their dreams with resilience and integrity. Just as the crowd began to thin, Jordan noticed a familiar face at the edge of the room. Emily stood there, watching him with an expression that was equal parts nervous and hopeful. She approached him hesitantly, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "Captain Cole," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you for responding to my message. I didn't think you would." Jordan gave her a small smile, his expression gentle. "Emily, change isn't easy, but it's possible. I'm glad you reached out." Her eyes shimmered with gratitude as she nodded. "I know I don't deserve forgiveness, but I've been working hard. I'm doing everything I can to understand, to do better. I know I still have a long way to go." But she paused, struggling to find the words. Jordan held her gaze, his voice calm but filled with a quiet strength. "The fact that you're here, that you're willing to learn and grow, that's what matters. This isn't about perfection, Emily, it's about progress." Emily took a deep breath, her shoulders visibly relaxing. "Do you think, would it be okay if I spoke to some of these young pilots? Maybe share my story as a lesson?" Jordan's smile grew, a sense of pride swelling within him. "I think that would be valuable. Sometimes, the best way to make amends is to use our experiences to help others avoid the same mistakes." With a grateful nod, Emily stepped forward to join the young scholarship recipients, sharing her story of growth, humility, and the lessons she had learned. Jordan watched her, feeling a sense of fulfillment he hadn't expected. This moment was proof that change was possible, that even the smallest actions could lead to a ripple effect of transformation. After the event, as the last guests began to leave, a young Latina pilot named Elena approached Jordan, her eyes bright with admiration. "Captain Cole," she began, her voice filled with emotion, "thank you for everything you've done. I used to think that people like me didn't belong in places like this. But seeing you, hearing your story, it makes me believe I could be part of this industry, too." Jordan felt a lump form in his throat, his chest swelling with pride. "Elena, you absolutely belong here. Remember, this sky belongs to all of us. Your journey, your determination, those are your strengths. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." Elena nodded, her face lighting up with a newfound determination. "Thank you, Captain Cole. I'll remember that." As he watched Elena walk away, Jordan felt a deep, profound sense of peace. This was why he had chosen to take on this role, to stand up to prejudice and to ensure that future generations wouldn't have to face the same struggles. The challenges had been worth it. Every moment of resistance now transformed into a path forward. As he left the building that evening, Jordan found himself reflecting on the journey. What had started as a single act of courage on a turbulent flight had turned into something so much larger. It had become a movement, a testament to resilience, the strength to forgive, and the courage to forge a better path for those who would come after. And as he looked up at the night sky, he felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. He was reminded that every obstacle, every challenge he had faced, had led him here. He was no longer just a pilot. He was a beacon of change, a symbol of hope, and a reminder that, no matter how dark the night, there was always a way forward. The following weeks passed in a blur of meetings, press appearances, and endless strategy sessions. Jordan had accepted the airline's offer to be a senior pilot and diversity consultant, splitting his time between flying and implementing new initiatives. It was a balance he hadn't anticipated, yet one that felt right. He was still in the sky, doing what he loved, but now he was also working to ensure a lasting legacy within the company. The airline was moving swiftly to put its promises into action. The first wave of diversity and inclusion training had rolled out across the organization, and plans for mentorship programs and scholarship funds for underrepresented groups were well underway. The company seemed genuinely invested in turning the turbulence of that fateful flight into meaningful, lasting change. Then one day, during a break between flights, Jordan received a message that stopped him cold. It was from Emily. "Captain Cole, I don't know if you'll even read this, but I wanted to reach out. I've been doing a lot of reflecting since that day. Losing my job was a wake-up call, and I understand now how deeply ingrained my own biases were. I'm attending diversity training courses, and I've even taken a job as a customer service representative. I know it's a step down, but it's given me a fresh perspective on the value of empathy. I just wanted to say that your words stayed with me. They pushed me to change. Jordan sat with the message for a long moment, feeling a mix of emotions: surprise, relief, and, finally, something that felt like closure. He had seen a spark of remorse in her eyes that day in the terminal. But this was something else. Emily had taken accountability, had chosen to confront her own prejudices, and actively worked to change. He typed a response, each word carefully chosen. Emily, thank you for reaching out. Change is never easy, and it takes courage to confront biases within ourselves. I'm glad you're taking this journey. Remember, progress is a daily choice. Wishing you all the best in your journey forward. After sending the message, Jordan felt a quiet peace settle over him. Forgiveness, he realized, wasn't about erasing the past, but allowing people the space to grow from it. He hadn't expected Emily to reach out, but her decision to own her mistakes reminded him that even the hardest hearts could soften with time and effort. A few weeks later, Jordan found himself back at the airline's headquarters for the launch of a new initiative. The airline had decided to establish a scholarship fund for aspiring pilots from underrepresented backgrounds. The program was close to Jordan's heart, a tangible way to open doors for young people who might have been overlooked or discouraged from pursuing aviation. As he stood at the podium, looking out at the crowd of employees, executives, and invited guests, he felt a powerful sense of purpose. He spoke about the importance of representation, of creating a world where everyone had a fair chance to soar, regardless of their background or the color of their skin. Today, he said, his voice steady, we're not just launching a scholarship. We're making a statement that talent, determination, and character will always take precedence over assumptions and prejudice. My hope is that these young aviators will go on to inspire others, and that the journey we began that day in the sky will continue in ways we can't yet imagine. As the event concluded, Jordan found himself surrounded by young, aspiring pilots who had come to witness the launch. Many of them looked at him with admiration and respect, and he felt a deep sense of responsibility. He spoke to each one, sharing advice, listening to their stories, and encouraging them to pursue their dreams with resilience and integrity. Just as the crowd began to thin, Jordan noticed a familiar face at the edge of the room. Emily stood there, watching him with an expression that was equal parts nervous and hopeful. She approached him hesitantly, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "Captain Cole," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you for responding to my message. I didn't think you would." Jordan gave her a small smile, his expression gentle. "Emily, change isn't easy, but it's possible. I'm glad you reached out." Her eyes shimmered with gratitude as she nodded. "I know I don't deserve forgiveness, but I've been working hard. I'm doing everything I can to understand, to do better. I know I still have a long way to go." But she paused, struggling to find the words. Jordan held her gaze, his voice calm but filled with a quiet strength. "The fact that you're here, that you're willing to learn and grow, that's what matters. This isn't about perfection, Emily, it's about progress." Emily took a deep breath, her shoulders visibly relaxing. "Do you think would it be okay if I spoke to some of these young pilots? Maybe share my story as a lesson?" Jordan's smile grew, a sense of pride swelling within him. "I think that would be valuable. Sometimes, the best way to make amends is to use our experiences to help others avoid the same mistakes." With a grateful nod, Emily stepped forward to join the young scholarship recipients, sharing her story of growth, humility, and the lessons she had learned. Jordan watched her, feeling a sense of fulfillment he hadn't expected. This moment was proof that change was possible, that even the smallest actions could lead to a ripple effect of transformation. After the event, as the last guests began to leave, a young Latina pilot named Elena approached Jordan, her eyes bright with admiration. "Captain Cole," she began, her voice filled with emotion, "thank you for everything you've done. I used to think that people like me didn't belong in places like this. But seeing you, Hearing your story, it makes me believe I could be part of this industry. 2. Jordan felt a lump form in his throat, his chest swelling with pride. Elena, you absolutely belong here. Remember, this sky belongs to all of us. Your journey, your determination, those are your strengths. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. Elena nodded, her face lighting up with a newfound determination. Thank you, Captain Cole. I'll remember that. As he watched Elena walk away, Jordan felt a deep, profound sense of peace. This was why he had chosen to take on this role, to stand up to prejudice and to ensure that future generations wouldn't have to face the same struggles. The challenges have been worth it. Every moment of resistance now transformed into a path forward. As he left the building that evening, Jordan found himself reflecting on the journey. What had started as a single act of courage on a turbulent flight had turned into something so much larger. It had become a movement, a testament to resilience, the strength to forgive, and the courage to forge a better path for those who would come after. And as he looked up at the night sky, he felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. He was reminded that every obstacle, every challenge he had faced, had led him here. He was no longer just a pilot. He was a beacon of change, a symbol of hope, and a reminder that, no matter how dark the night, there was always a way forward.